Hello and welcome back to the Premier Injury Channel. Today is the first kind of reunion of all of us, for the Premier Injuries podcast. So before we get into our analysis of Ngolo Kante, I'm going to throw it to Ben. How are you doing today?
Good to be back in the hot seat, Jay. Raj. Well, actually not Raj, after what you've been said off air. You've got a little bit of, work to do to get back and make good books. But no, great to see the boys. Hey, great to see that fantastic beard of yours, Raj, and the headband. Yeah, you kind of knock that. No.
And Raj as well. I mean, the thing is, you've been on the channel a couple of times with me, so it's not really kind of coming back for you. It's just another week with me, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wore the headband just in case, Romero comes and tries to get someone's hair again. So maybe they'll call it this time.
Yeah. But, we're talking about Romero there, the Chelsea match. I mean, it was a fantastic game in terms of competitiveness. It was a terrible game in terms of refereeing decisions. But one of the big moments of the game was Kante getting injured once again. So, Ben, what is the latest on that injury?
Yeah, so we heard from Thomas Tuchel post-match. Obviously, the question was posed, do we have an update on Ngolo Kante? Of course, he'll be sent for imaging and scan results will probably come back, or maybe it's even been known now internally, maybe over the next 24 to possibly 72 hours. But Thomas Tuchel gave us an indication of the severity of that, and he expects bad news. He said it was a strong injury, implying that it wasn't good, and we're certainly looking more on that severe end of the scale, I would expect.
So looking at that information there from Thomas Tuchel, Raj, what can you kind of surmise from that? What kind of hamstring injury are we talking about?
Yeah, typically hamstring injuries are graded grade 1, 2, and 3, 1 being mild, 2 moderate, 3 severe. There's more detailed grading systems too, depending on the location of the tear as well. But just generally, grade 2 tear, if you say the strong injury, I'm assuming it's at least a grade 2, looking at typically that 3 to 6 week period. Then the question becomes, it could potentially be a grade 3 rupture too, in which case surgery may or may not be required. In that case, you're looking at typically 8 to 9 weeks plus, depending on what the treatment is. So and then you add in the other confounder here with Kante. He now has an extensive soft tissue injury history, right? And so you're concerned about loss of fitness. You're concerned about re-injury risks in general with this type of injury, even more so for a player like him.
Well, Roger, sorry, I was just going to say, Roger, you raise a good point there, just with regards to his, I suppose, even recent injury history. If we go back to up until basically he turned pro, all the way through until 2018-19, we had a midfielder whose availability record was second to none. We're talking about literally 99% throughout his competitive career in terms of those league appearances and minutes. Then he picks up that knee injury prior to that Europa League final with Arsenal. So back end May 2019. And from that point, we've actually had 22 reported injury incidents plus 2 time loss COVID absences. I mean, the question is Kante broke?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I know I often touch on the re-injury cycle, especially for guys who have played, in a lot of games like he did, high intensity games as well. Once you get stuck in that cycle, it can be really, really difficult to get out of it, especially on the tail end of your career. Because we know as you age, I think there's some research showing, I think for hamstrings, it's 10%. Every year you play at the highest level, you have a 10% increase in hamstring injury risk, just generally. And then you add in the amount of games he's played, the intensity of games he's played, and the responsibility he has in the games he's played, right? And you combine that, like you said, with that knee injury. Once you get into that cycle, becomes a vicious cycle, because we know previous injury is the highest indicator of future injury by far. You lose fitness, and then it just snowballs from there, right? And that's exactly what has happened for Kante. I don't remember, did Kante play in that league final game?
Yeah, he was patched up and he played 90 minutes in that Europa game that Arsenal lost 4-1, by the way, just in case he did forget that. Two Arsenal supporters here, by the way, if you're watching for the first time, and yeah, so you can almost pinpoint his downturn in availability to that precise moment. He missed the summer, returned late, so he didn't have that cornerstone, that foundation of off-season work that could carry him through the remainder of the campaign. And you look at in terms of his minutes played since that point, we're looking at a player now who's around about 54% of all Chelsea's Premier League minutes. And, for such a key and pivotal player who was at the top of his game and almost, unbreakable at one point, it's quite shocking that almost that fall from grace.
Yeah, I think it just speaks to the point about really how damaging it can be to try and play through an injury. Like it can have these massive knock-on effects. I mean, speaking of Arsenal, we saw it last year with Tomiyasu. Tried to play through a calf injury because Suarez was hurt, impacted him literally up until preseason, right? He's now back playing. He had a bounce game, but it can take 6, 7, 8 months to get back. And then if you get re-injured, you're back into that mixer. So I think that's really the inflection point with Kante, and another case in point of the dangers of trying to play through injury.
Do you think that because of this history, then, Ben, you've given the fact that on average it's a 4 to 6 week period of turnaround. Do you think, though, that it could be extended to 8, maybe 10 weeks, just because they want to treat him conservatively? They do have a bit of backup there in the squad.
The issue that you have in football, in terms, you're in a very time crunched environment. Very rarely are players allowed to recover and recuperate, in an ideal world. Stakeholders, managers, coaches, particularly with high status, high profile players, will want to know, when's Kante coming back? The games are coming thick and fast. We've talked about this winter World Cup. So we're talking about an additional 4 Premier League games, an additional 2 Champions League games around, over that same period of time. And yeah, they've got a little bit of backup in there. Kovacic sidelined at the moment with a knee problem. But, you're still going to want Kante out on that pitch. And, and he'll want to be, those decisions will be player-led. He will want to be back out on the pitch. We've seen historically, Tuchel manages players very, very well. I would say, it's almost had an exemplary record up until he decided to throw Ben Chilwell on for a couple of minute cameo at the end of the season, which I didn't quite get. This latest, decision with regards to Mateo Kovacic, he has been managing a little bit of a knee problem in recent times, and now he's decided to pull him out of training and take him away, and because that load that was going through his leg was causing a reaction within that. So maybe we'll see Chelsea, Tuchel, and the decision to manage Kante, very, very carefully given his history. But, we're still talking about a significant period of time on the sidelines.
Passing it to you, Raj.
Yeah, just one thing. It's also a double-edged sword to leave players out for longer, because you have to. The risk, the reward is okay. You allow it to heal a little bit more, right? But the risk is you can't replicate match fitness outside of matches. And so that's the risk and reward you have to then weigh as you get towards, let's say it's a 6-week injury. They won't give a timeline typically, but let's say, right? And then you think to yourself, we give him 1 more week. How much more is he going to recover versus how much will he benefit from playing in a bounce game, right? So that's what you have to start weighing, are those options as you get to that point.
And I guess a follow-up question to you, Raj, is last week we talked about the World Cup factor into thinking about these decisions. Is maybe a flip side that Kante himself might rush himself back because he wants to get that fitness to represent his country in the upcoming World Cup?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that in so many examples. I mean, TT pretty much ruined his career trying to get back for the World Cup against medical advice. So there's so much. I mean, guys want to play in the World Cup, and I don't blame them. I understand why. So that's a very valid point.
So let's move it to the footage analysis then. And just going to put it up on screen here. But as you can kind of see, he's running along. He changes direction just a little bit. But then there's this ping. I guess it's kind of the hamstring ping, the atypical one. I mean, first and foremost to you, Raj, Why does that happen? Why do players kind of, edge up and then suddenly grab the back of their hamstring?
Because it hurts, man. But no, seriously. I mean, it's during the acceleration phase. I mean, on this, you're accelerating while changing direction. So it's a double stress on that hamstring. And so, the hamstring during running, especially during acceleration, it's acting to slow that leg down before it hits the ground. And that's typically where the highest stress on the hamstring is during any running. And so that's typically, I think he grabbed lower down on this side, in this example. But yeah, the hamstring goes through what we call an eccentric phase, where it's lengthening while contracting, which is the highest load on it. And that's typically when players will feel that hamstring kind of ping. If it's usually on that, or when they're stretching, to control the ball. But more often than not, it's during that sprint or acceleration phase. That's why generally higher sprinting speed is associated with higher risk of hamstring injury.
I wanted to throw to you as well, Ben, with this footage here. Post this kind of Kante going to the floor, grabbing his hamstring, looking at what the staff are doing now, they're grabbing his knee, though, which I found quite interesting. I mean, why isn't the focus on the hamstring? Is that part of the testing of the whole area?
I mean, there will be some passive testing involved in that, but, before the medical team even get onto the pitch, they will know exactly what's going on. They're watching video and analysis from their iPads, from their handheld devices, from the dugout. Maybe they're looking for some sites, secondary issues, any structural damage in and around the knee. If it was, low, as Raj indicated, and it looked as if it was a distal problem, then, you have that insertion point, and you could have the pain presenting behind the knee as well. So sometimes it's not quite as clear, or like I say, there may be other secondary damage in and around that joint as well.
And I just want to bring it then on to maybe the longevity issues. As you said, Ben, is Kante broken? But I want to bring it almost a step back for maybe a layperson as well. So how does one go about preventing these injuries, Raj? How can somebody train to stop a recurrence of a hamstring injury?
Well, it's not easy. I mean, even at the elite level, there's a massive recurrence of hamstring injuries. I mean, the biggest thing, a couple of things. One is you have to, one I would say is see a professional to do it. Hamstring injuries are not easy to deal with. Even as a provider, they're one of the hardest things to manage because of how much load goes through them. So I would say one, do that. Two is you want a progressive, methodical rehab and ramp up. And that also means your rehab should consist of intensities that will replicate your in-game demands. I have heard so many athletes who are like, I re-injured my hamstring when I was sprinting in the game. And I'll ask them, well, did you sprint at all before you went back to sports? And they'll say no. And I'm like, well, yeah, naturally, because you're going to get hurt again because your hamstring's not acclimated, right, to that load. And then lastly, in general, I mean, one of the most, I think, research-driven exercises. It's a high-level one, but it's pretty much called what's the name for it? Not the Nordic. It is the
Nordic.
The Nordic hamstring curl. Excuse me. I was going to say Copenhagen. That's for adductors. But it's the Nordic. It's the Nordic, and so that's one of the most research-driven. Although you have to build up to that as well. That's a high load, eccentric load on that hamstring. So just being methodical, being progressive. And, I think we've seen a shift, and I think Ben can speak to this as well. We've seen a big shift towards physios and training teams putting guys through higher intensities, whether it's, during training, even if they're not hurt, to allow their bodies to acclimate to those higher loads.
Yeah, what about your opinion on this, Ben? I mean, what can be done to prevent these sorts of injuries?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Again, just to touch upon that, point of with Raj, we spoke about to Phil Hayward about how they're getting players transitioning from that early phase from the sports science department, from the physios, and then into that first team, and they made that decision very early on to instead of completing that final phase with the physio, almost just putting them in with the first team and letting them mimic those game time environments, and they found that first and foremost, that the players were transitioning quicker. They suffered fewer setbacks, fewer recurrences, fewer injury. And ultimately, what that did, that enabled or that expedited that return to performance, which is really what everybody wants. It's not necessarily the return to play. What we need is that return to performance. And, it's sometimes difficult. I think physically, it's easy sometimes to manage that injury, but psychologically, particularly if you're, an explosive player, quick changes of direction, quick feet, you're reliant upon that burst of pace, that acceleration over the first maybe 5-10 yards, then something, if you're having recurrent hamstring problems, that's when it gets into your mind, and, you maybe start to alter your game, alter your gait a little bit, don't take as many risks, and maybe play a little bit more conservatively, and ultimately if that's starting to affect what happens on the pitch, then just because somebody is returning to play, that doesn't necessarily mean they're 100% ready.
And I wanted to ask both of you about, maybe should Kante be getting examples from Mikel Antonio, because there's been a lot of articles, coming out in the last few weeks about how he's changed his training, his diet, basically everything about his lifestyle so that he could recover. And we've seen the results. So how realistic is that kind of turnaround from, Antonio has a rich history of terrible hamstring injuries. What is the realities there of kind of getting that turnaround? I guess throwing it to you, Ben.
Yeah, look, we've discussed this before. Just because a player is an elite in a certain area of his life, i.e., a professional footballer, in this case, that doesn't mean that they're elite in every other aspect of your life. And by his own admission, Mikel Antonio knew that there were aspects of his life that he could improve significantly if he wanted to try and reduce that risk of injury incidents and the burden on his team. And he was able to address that. I don't hear of any concerns, certainly with what's been happening off the field with Ngolo Kante. He comes across as an utmost professional in terms of how he lives his life. So when you're talking about, you've got that base of somebody who already, does a lot of the good things really, really well, then the margins for improvement are very small. And sometimes you just have to accept that, do you know what? This is injury is part and parcel of elite sports. And sometimes you maybe try to mitigate, you maybe try to manage the situation, but almost, like I say, when you're in that cycle, you maybe have to accept that you went from a player with 95, 96% plus availability in minutes. As you're getting a little bit older, then you may have to accept that you're a 50 to 60 to a 70% availability, player going forward.
What do you think on that then, Raj?
Ben's completely right there in terms of, I haven't heard anything about Kante to say that his habits haven't been, aren't already kind of, finally tuned in. So at that point, it's almost like, what else can you kind of squeeze out of the orange in that case? Sometimes you just have to accept that it is what it is, and you got to plan for that new reality. And that's potentially the case here with Kante.
Well, this brings me on to the last discussion point. Longer term, he's now missed 519 days since being at Chelsea, 201 since 2021. Does this cast worries over his ability to even play in the top flight? He's only 31. We've seen a lot of people like Ronaldo playing 37 plus years old. But is the reality now that does he have to have discussions with Chelsea over management of his load, or does he sometimes have to make the decision himself that, this isn't for me anymore? Because long term as well, this could have impacts of pain and arthritis, other sorts of injuries that may be related to this later in life. I mean, what kind of considerations have to be made there, Raj?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I mentioned, like sometimes there's a new reality you have to think about, especially if you've exhausted all other options, right? And so that's something that I think at some point now, considering the injury history that he gave in the last couple of years, right? That's not something you can just ignore and say this just keeps happening due to chance. That's a very strong pattern there. And so these are hard questions that Kante, his support staff around him and Chelsea will have to ask him and themselves.
I mean, Ben, is it a consideration, retirement, or at least moving to a different league?
Look, football is a business now. Let's forget about loyalty. Ultimately, this point, when owners take on board, it's money. There's opportunities there. Now, with Ngolo Kante, look, he's been a great servant to the club. He's been, a player at the pinnacle of his game and considered probably one of the world's best midfielders of his generation. There comes a point where, your body cannot tolerate the physical demands of the game, particularly in the Premier League, we know, in terms of maybe distance covered, but certainly those high intensity, explosive sprints, which are putting that additional strain through those hamstrings, then maybe it's because, the decision may be taken out of his hands by the club, but also that'll come down to N'Golo Kante and what he wants. If Chelsea want to retain him, it may be that he'd be managed in its limited minutes and limited game time. Or, if Conte wants more than that, then he may look to go, somewhere else, maybe, across the La Liga or France or maybe Germany, Italy, to maybe prolong his career and play more minutes in a game which, like I say, doesn't have the same intensity of that Premier League.
I guess the final question, maybe a quick summary of all the points, but you put the question there, Ben. I think it's a good one. Is Kante broken, Raj?
I hate the word broken. I mean, the reality is, I think, like I said, the pattern now is clear enough that there's significant injury risk that I don't ever expect him to, go above, be consistently available in the Premier League. At least, the responsibility, the way he plays, we know the way he's going to play. And so I certainly think the time is coming where he's going to need that change of scenery to allow your body doesn't lie. It doesn't. And when you have this many injuries over this amount of time, you have to make a certain, adjustment and ask those hard questions, like I said before. So I think certainly the sun is likely setting on his Chelsea career and probably his Premier League career. And like Ben said, he does have other options and it might be the best for him moving forward.
And Ben?
Look, I think it's difficult. It will be, he's a player that has delivered, but I think questions will be asked by the Chelsea hierarchy. He's one of Chelsea's highest earners, and that comes down to a business decision. Do you want one of your highest earners within the club who only comes in or has only plays half the time year on year? And that's a decision that you need to make, and if they've got the players in and around that can maybe come in and absorb that, and then you're rolling Kante out for the Champions League and big Premier League matches and accept that maybe he's only able to play one game every 7, one game every 10 days, without breaking down, then great. But like I say, that there'll be questions asked just because of the sheer, financial impact that it would have on the club and maybe the structural of the wage and potentially bringing in other players as well.
Yeah, you also, just one contextual thing, you also have a new owner at Chelsea who may not be loyal to Kante and also is trying to make a big splash to try and win games consistently. So for him, it's okay, let me bring in someone who can be there consistently that my manager can rely on. So there's that contextual aspect too.
Well, I think that wraps up the discussions there for the Kante injury situation. As always, make sure to stay subscribed to the channel so that you keep up to date with all this information. Do head over to FreeCB Performance and the amazing content that you put out there, Raj. And we will be back next week for another discussion. So you can tweet us, you can message us, you can comment below if you've got any questions, but we will be back very, very soon. So for now, have a good week. and good luck and have some good health as well.